Okay, well, I have 2 o'clock East Coast time, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. If you guys are having any audio issues, please let us know, send us a chat message, but hopefully you guys are all connected to the audio and ready to go for today's presentation. Welcome to the Produce Safety Educators Call. My name is Gretchen Wall, and I'm the coordinator for the Produce Safety Alliance and also the Northeast Extension Associate. And today's presentation is focused on key legal questions associated with the FSMA Produce Safety Rule compliance. And we have 2 fantastic speakers today, Sophia Kruszewski and Elizabeth Newbold. And before I get started into the presentation and introductions, I just wanted to go over a few quick instructions if you're new to this call. And I have a couple announcements that I'm going to cover up front related to this group in our next educators call that will be happening in June. But for now, all participants are going to be muted. There is going to be time for questions and discussions at the end of the meeting, but feel free to use the chat box if you have some questions, and we can get to those throughout the presentation if they're small clarification questions, but we'll probably hold most of the questions towards the end. We are recording this session, and as usual, we will share it through the listserv, and it'll also be posted on our website. So if you have to drop off the call early, it will be on our website for you to check out afterwards. Our next meeting is going to be held on Monday, June 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And the focus of that is going to be on becoming a PSA lead trainer, how to build your foundation for training success. And if you've been with the Produce Safety Educators Group for a while now, you might recall that in 2018, we actually did a webinar on this topic, but this one is going to be a little bit different. Donna and I are going to be doing some presentations and background information about the lead trainer process. So if you are somebody or you have a colleague that's interested in becoming a PSA lead trainer, we're going to cover that process, but really we're going to focus on how do you set yourself up for success as a lead trainer long-term? In the second half of that particular meeting, we will have several experienced PSA lead trainers to share their perspectives about how they filled the lead trainer role and how they prepared for it. So that will be our June meeting. We will set up the Zoom link and registration page here shortly. So check your email, keep an eye out for our newsletter that we send out to this group. And also it'll be posted on the website if you happen to miss the email. So we'll get that out to you very shortly. Then one other announcement is from FDA regarding the food traceability challenge. And FDA is asking stakeholders, including technology providers, entrepreneurs, innovators, to develop traceability tools that can be implemented in a scalable, cost-effective way for food operations of all sizes. I bring this up because you yourself may have experience in traceability or working with farms who are implementing no-cost or low-cost technologies on their farm. So we wanted to share this opportunity with you, or if you are working with students or a group that's interested in participating in this challenge. The submission window closes on July 30th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And I believe Donna is going to be dropping you some links if you happen to miss that announcement to that particular challenge. And then they've also launched, they being the FDA, a quarterly podcast called The Tech Talk that is focused on the newer era of smarter food safety and traceability initiatives. So do check out those resources and consider participating in that traceability challenge. So I'm very pleased to welcome our 2 speakers today, Sophia Kruszewski, who's the Clinic Director for the Center of Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School, and also Elizabeth Newbold, who's the Assistant Director at the Northeast Center to Advance Food Safety through University of Vermont Extension. And I was really excited about this presentation today because I had the opportunity to serve on the advisory group for the Extension Legal Services Initiative through the Vermont School and NECAFS, to answer some of these tough legal questions that we as educators often come across related to compliance with the FSMA Produce Safety Rule for both farmers and food processors. So if you haven't checked out the resources that are coming out of this particular project, I know both Sophia and Elizabeth are going to talk about those resources today, but I know Donna is dropping you the links in the chat box if you hadn't had time to check out the fact sheets that have been produced. So thanks again to Sophia and Elizabeth for joining us today. And with that, I am going to stop screen sharing and turn it over to Sophia.
Thanks so much, Gretchen. I'm going to pull up the presentation and then Elizabeth, please take it away. Are you able to see the presentation?
I think it just needs to be in presentation mode.
Oh no, this is what happened last time. It actually is in presentation mode on my computer. Let's see if I can figure this out. Otherwise, Elizabeth, I may have to ask you to pull it up instead.
Sure.
It's still not working.
Are you working on double screens? Because if you are, it might just be a matter of swapping the screen that you're sharing, maybe.
Let's see. Is that working?
Still the same.
Okay, Elizabeth, I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to have you
No,
do
that's
it.
okay. Yep.
There we go.
Okay. Well, thank you, Gretchen, for the introduction, and thanks to everybody for joining this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. Appreciate it. Yeah, Sophia and I are excited to share the outcomes of our project, and we are just wrapping up this 2-year project, and so we're really thrilled to walk through the resources with all of you today and let you know the outcomes of this work and then answer any questions that you have. So just in terms of an overview, we'll start with introductions, go through the background of this project, how did it come to be, talk through the intended users and audience for these resources. We'll walk through each of the resources and give some general main takeaways from each of them. Definitely take a minute to acknowledge all of the input and those who helped us make this project happen. And then again, we'll take questions and discussion at the end. So as Gretchen already did, introduction, Sophia is from the Center for Ag and Food Systems at Vermont Law School, and I'm with the Northeast Center to Advance Food Safety at University of Vermont Extension. So by way of background, as I mentioned, we're coming up on actually almost closing out the 3rd year of this project, and this originated because we know that FSMA Produce Safety Rule is a significant development related to produce safety, and as we were rolling out education and starting to talk about the Produce Safety Rule, there were a lot of questions, legal questions that were coming up at multiple points in conversations with growers and partners. And it became very clear that there was a need to actually articulate what those common legal questions are and start to do some legal research to provide some clarity and information around that to better inform all of us and the members of the produce community. And so in order to drive this project and actually figure out what those key legal questions are, we distributed a survey across the nation at the start of this project in order to gather some of those questions. And so we had 29 responses from across the nation. As I said, 42% of those questions came directly from growers, 22 were educators, 13% were regulators, and then the remaining were consultants, buyers, industry partners, and other members of the produce community. And so we had a fairly great representation, and we were really pleased with the overwhelming response that we had from growers specifically to this survey. And so from there, what we did was we grouped the topics, the legal topics, by common thread and identified those top subject matters that were identified. And this is a bulleted list here for you. And then with the help of the advisory group, we had 2 intensive days where we actually walked through the raw data. We took these priority area topics, and we informed them based on the specific examples that were provided through that national survey in order to craft, frame, and form legal questions that would get at the heart of what people were looking to have addressed within each of these topic areas. And so from there, then the questions were turned over to the students at the Center for Ag and Food Systems at Vermont Law School to start actually doing that fundamental research to inform the outputs that we'll describe later in this presentation. And so I'll turn it to Sophia to talk about the use and audience.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So the intention behind the resources is really that each one could stand on its own. There is some cross-referencing where information in one resource is relevant to another, but they all assume some basic understanding of the produce safety rule or the preventive controls rule, with the idea being that they might be shared as part of other produce safety education efforts. Of course, they're not intended to provide any individualized legal advice, but really introduce and explain different legal concepts and considerations. And as far as the intended audience goes, as we mentioned, because many of these questions came up in the course of doing other produce safety and outreach or other produce safety outreach and education, many came up through educators or regulators based on conversations that they had been having with folks on the ground. The idea behind the resources is that they're designed to be useful for the farmers themselves, but also for people who work with them, like educators and ag service providers. And so we're figuring that some producers or processors may find and access these resources directly, but really they would be most useful coming through trusted service providers in response to a question that you may receive related to one of these legal topics, maybe while you're out doing some on-farm food safety work. So we had both those primary and secondary audiences in mind while developing the fact sheets, and then also some of the other resources that we're going to talk a bit about. So the first resource that I want to highlight is this map that illustrates how the produce safety rule is being implemented in each state. Many of the questions that came up through our project really hinged on how states might be doing things a little bit differently, maybe in terms of inspections or appeals or verifying qualified exemptions. So we compiled this information based on either what law states had on the books or just by contacting some state departments of ag directly where we couldn't find the relevant information. And we compiled all this information on the website, and you can filter the map to show some of the variations in state approaches, like does the state have any of its own law in place about the produce safety rule? And then if so, does the state law address things like penalties or appeals or a farm registry? And so you can also find that information below the map via a table that's on the site. And then we're also developing sort of a more static fact sheet version that you could print out and be able to review as well. And we certainly recognize that, in some states, things are still in flux in terms of some of these questions, or whether there may be statute, but not yet regulations. And so we really welcome any feedback or updates that you may be aware of with regard to specific states to help us keep this map current, because the idea is that we'll continue updating the table, which then feeds into this map so we can have a really up-to-date picture of how things are playing out across the country. So moving on to the next fact sheet that I want to share a bit with you about. So one topic that came up in our research had to do with legal consequences or protections associated with a produce safety rule inspection or a produce audit. So this fact sheet provides some background on why we have both audits and inspections, and compares and contrasts the liability impacts of passing or failing an audit versus being found in or out of compliance during a PSR inspection. I'm sure for many of you, this information is really familiar, but it came up a lot in our survey from a liability perspective. What are the implications of being in or out of compliance or passing or failing an audit? And so we prioritized it as a topic where additional research and resources from that legal perspective would be useful. The next fact sheet I want to touch on is about farms with multiple business entities. So this fact sheet is based around the question that seems to come up with some frequency about whether a farm with multiple business entities needs to count the sales from all of the separate entities together for purposes of calculating the qualified exemption sales threshold. And as with many legal questions, the answer here depends on the specific circumstances. But based on our research, we think there may be circumstances where it is appropriate to aggregate sales from separate business entities. There may also be circumstances where it isn't. And so this resource presents some common scenarios where a farm might operate multiple business entities and discusses the considerations that would make it more or less appropriate to aggregate those sales. The main takeaway being that forming a separate legal entity exclusively to keep sales below the exemption threshold should really be considered alongside tax, labor, estate planning, and other business goals and considerations. We also wrote a law journal article about this that we're publishing soon that gives more of the legal analysis and recommendation for how to apply these factors. And we'll put that on the site as well. But the idea is to present some factors to consider in moving through some of these different scenarios. And then the last fact sheet that I'm going to share a bit about talks about the PSR provisions that an alternative or a variance would apply to, who's eligible to develop an alternative or a variance, the approval process for each, and the high burden of supporting either an alternative or a variance with credible scientific and technical evidence. And as with the fact sheet on inspections and audits, I imagine this information is fairly straightforward for many of you, but there was interest in developing this kind of resource from, again, a legal perspective, particularly in examining what that same level of public health protection standard might require. So this fact sheet addresses that standard at a pretty high level. But on this topic, we're also publishing another journal article that delves more deeply into that question, drawing from other sources of law to identify how that standard might apply to a PSR variance request in particular. And so once that's published, we'll also make that available alongside this fact sheet on the website to be able to sort of meet multiple audience needs or multiple purposes. So with that, I will turn it back over to Elizabeth to walk through the remaining resources.
Great. So the next one is FSMA supply chain program requirements for processors and their produce suppliers. And this question was put together because we were finding that processors who are purchasing raw product from farms were asking exempt or qualified exempt farmers for information demonstrating their coverage or the compliance with the produce safety rule when in fact they didn't need to do that. And so this fact sheet illustrates through a flow chart what decisions a processor who has a supply chain program needs to consider when they're asking their exempt or qualified exempt supplying farms or qualified farm mixed type facilities for certain forms of documentation to actually prove that they are in compliance with the produce safety rule without having to be in full compliance with the produce safety rule. So this just takes the time to actually articulate what documentation is needed so that processors can purchase from exempt and qualified exempt farms without requiring full compliance with the produce safety rule. Next is understanding the relationship between FDA rules, guidance, and other communications. And I'm sure many of you can relate to this. This question was brought up because there was sort of just wondering what the legal effect would be from getting different forms of communication from different sources from the FDA. And so we have guidance, we've got the rule, we've got the TAN questions and answers, we have the Produce Safety Network, verbal communication, email communication. And so what is the different level of weight that's put on those different forms of communication? When are they informative and when are they binding? And when, how should a grower interact with those? And so this fact sheet talks about how the Produce Safety Rule is legally binding and that guidance, TAN responses, and the Produce Safety Network are informative and interpretive at that point in time, but are non-binding. However, these forms of communication can be influential in court. So when making regulatory decisions or in the event of a lawsuit, they could be brought in as indication of something that a good practice that could have been followed or perhaps wasn't followed, or alternatively, if it was followed by a grower and therefore could weigh in on that decision making. This was a big one. This was actually the very first priority item that was articulated, and it's produce farms, foodborne illness, and legal liability. And this was something that was a question that came around with the idea that there seemed to be a lot of communication or questions rather about the idea that FSMA created liability for produce growers where none previously existed, that now suddenly because of the Food Safety Modernization Act, producers were liable where before that they were not. And so this fact sheet walks through the very different forms of liability that producers have always been subject to, and adds nuance to articulate how FSMA adds to that existing liability and how those considerations should be taken by growers. It also talks about how being in compliance or not being in compliance can be beneficial in the event of a lawsuit. And so one of the questions we often have is, if I'm in compliance with the produce safety rule, does that prevent me from being held liable? And the answer is no. If the foodborne illness is traced back to your farm, you're still liable. However, compliance with the produce safety rule can help to mitigate any financial or criminal responsibilities in the event of a lawsuit. And so this fact sheet just walks through all of those specific forms of liability and provides greater context around FSMA specifically. The next is using the FDA Technical Assistance Network and FOIA, which is Freedom of Information Act, to access information about FSMA. And so this question is based on something that we were often hearing is, there are all these questions that are going into the TAN and answers that are coming out, and likely those questions and answers are something that would be relevant to others within the produce community. Can't we just see that whole body of information? And by looking at the laws and rules that the FDA has to follow, we did learn that privacy limits FDA's ability to just do a blanket release of TAN questions and answers. And so knowing that that's not something that we can get, we do know that through a Freedom of Information Act request, someone could articulate specific TAN questions and answers that they would want released through a FOIA request, and FDA would need to release that. There may be some process of redacting information if it's, that it's private or confidential, but that is an avenue that an individual could use to access some of these TAN questions and answers. And actually, and then within the fact sheet, it talks about how to actually go about doing that. So if you're not familiar with how to submit a FOIA request, there is information in there on how to do that. And one of the outputs of this project was to actually go through that process. And so we submitted a FOIA request to FDA for some TAN questions and answers on the farm definition. And that information was released to us through that request, and it has been posted on the clearinghouse. So the questions and answers relating to the farm definition that we received through a FOIA request have now been posted on the clearinghouse. So just so you know, the process works. We went through it and we're successful in getting some information. Okay, so that's the full list of all the resources that have been created and are posted on the project website. As Sophia made reference to, there's a few more coming. And so I just wanted to point this out. So all of the resources are available at the project website, which is lc.necafs.org. And this is where you can go to find that interactive map, and also all of the other resources which are in PDF form. A link to that, all of this information has also been put on the clearinghouse. So we currently have 8 resources, and we have additional resources coming. So a couple more PDFs resources that cover market intermediaries, the produce safety rules interaction with other state and federal laws. Sophia mentioned we have a more in-depth white paper on liability. We are planning to do a PDF type thing of the state interactive map with info. So if you're not at a computer and able to interact with the map, you can print out a PDF that has the photo or the map, a picture of each of the maps with some description, so that the material can be translated away from being interactive online. And then there's 2 journal articles that are currently in the publication process. One is on the farm entity, more deep dive into when a farm entity is considered separate or together, and then another on alternatives and variances. And so before we close, I do want to just take a minute to acknowledge the project advisors. And this was really a very dedicated group of individuals from across the nation. While Sophia and I are both in the Northeast region, this was not a region-specific project. It was national in scope. And so We had representation from all of our regions and from all of the different sectors within the produce community in order to gain those perspectives in forming the questions and also in providing feedback on all of the resources. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, all of the project advisors came together to actually help us form those questions, but they all came together in the second year to actually go through, provide detailed commentary and feedback on every single one of the resources and address the information that was there so that it was accurate and descriptive of those varying perspectives. And I cannot thank them enough for the dedication that they've provided to this project. And then finally, the students and the interns who provided all the fundamental research that fed this information and Sophia's guidance of them and the leadership that she provided to all of them as they were in the clinic and under her guidance in furthering the goals of this project. And then finally, the design work, the web design work, photos, and our funding for this project came through the National Ag Library at the USDA. And so without that, this wouldn't have been possible. And so thanks to everybody who was part of this great work. So with that, that's the end of what we wanted to cover and can open it up to questions and discussion.
Great. Thanks so much, Elizabeth and Sophia, for highlighting all of those great resources. I did receive a couple private messages saying, wow, these resources are great. I didn't know about these. And I think people are very happy that a lot of their burning questions are hopefully going to be answered in some of these fact sheets that have been developed. But I think we'll pause here and let some folks chime in either using the chat box, or if you raise your hand, I can go ahead and unmute your line. So if you want to ask a question verbally, feel free to do so. I see while we're letting people enter in some questions, I see one question that came in from Weston. Are you and your staff at NECAFS available to call and consult if my department's attorney general and I have legal questions if a difficult incident occurs?
So I will let Sophia talk about that. At NECAFS, for NECAFS specifically, we aren't, I'm not while I'm an attorney, I'm not a practicing attorney and don't provide any legal advice. And so I'll let Sophia talk about what her availability might be at the law school.
We would certainly be happy to field calls, either from folks, but just based on the resources themselves or particular situations that you're encountering. We are, of course, also bound by where we're licensed to practice and some of the advice that we give. But I would certainly be happy to call and brainstorm and troubleshoot. And so I don't know if my contact information is on any of the slides, but I'll put my email address into the box here, and I certainly welcome folks reaching out. And as I mentioned before, particularly with the state map as well, we're certainly always interested in keeping that as up to date as possible. And so if you are reviewing any of the information on the site and you think that there's something that your state is doing that isn't reflected accurately, we want to hear from you so that we can keep that updated as well. So happy to speak with you just about what you're working on, but any feedback that you have also on the materials is always very welcome.
Yeah, and I will add that if people have questions about the material and how to read the content in the fact sheets, we really tried to use lay language so that it was approachable, but we recognize that some of it may just need some additional conversation. In that case, absolutely either of us would be more than happy to connect and do a deeper dive into the content and the resources.
Okay, I have a question from Louisa. So Louisa, I've allowed you to unmute yourself, so go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
I just got a new computer and audio has been such a trip.
You sound great.
Thank you. Can you please repeat what the fact sheet is about with the FSMA supply chain program requirements for processors and their produce suppliers? Because I have a follow-up question, but I want to make sure I understand the specifics of that fact sheet.
Sure. So that one is about produce suppliers who are exempt or qualified exempt farms or qualified exempt mixed type facilities. So the documentation that they would need to give to processors to be part of their supply chain program.
So what if they're not exempt? What kind of documentation would they forward to their processors? I've been trying to get an answer from our food safety folks for the Preventive Control for Human Food Rule as to what they look at when they're doing inspections for processors to go back to the people who supply raw produce, like, you know, the ingredients to the processing. So I'm wondering, in that sense, what kind of documentation is there a need to show to the processor from the raw agricultural commodity producer?
So you're saying if the farm is fully covered?
Yeah, correct.
Sophia, do you remember off the top of your head? I was going to look because
Yeah,
we have it in the
fact
flow
sheet-
chart.
Right, the fact sheet does speak to that also, because part of the genesis behind this one was just in some ways to be able to empower the producer themselves, you know, the supplier, to be able to have that resource to be able to look at and say, like, this is actually, you know, what I'm required to do under PSR, whether they're exempt or qualified exempt or fully covered. So we do have a section in the fact sheet that talks a bit about verification of a fully covered produce farm. And under the rule, the supply chain program rule, a facility has to consider the farm's food safety practice, FDA compliance history, and food safety history, and may require an on-farm audit in certain circumstances. So those are sort of the general categories. What that documentation would specifically look like outside of the audit, I don't think there's like a really specific you know, form that might take, but being able to provide some documentation of, you know, in terms of FDA compliance history. So is there any to be able to point toward, you know, was there an inspection that happened or some other, you know, documentation that you can show, or, you know, is there a farm food safety plan that they might look at, anything to sort of evidence the producer's compliance with the produce safety rule.
Okay, yeah, thank you. You know, I'm thinking, you know, what do we need to teach the processor to be looking for? And then for the regulators, the inspectors of the warehouses and manufacturing processes, what do they need to be looking for in that inspection of what is going on with the raw agricultural commodity and that grower and what they're supplying in terms of documentation? So there's, yeah, I have to get my brain around this one, but I can't wait to read that document. So thank you.
All right. I also see a question. Luke has raised his hand. So Luke, I've allowed you to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Sorry, that was my finger twitching. Never mind.
Okay. Going back to the chat box, then I see there's a question from Stuart asking, can you give some additional details on the same level of public health protection standard as it relates to variance applications?
Yeah, for that one, I may have to say we're gonna wait until this article comes out, where we go into as much detail as we can share based on some review of some international law standards. You know, we do put into the fact sheet a bit some discussion of how the FDA might view that same level of public health protection standard. And so, you know, who has conducted the determination, what is the degree of scientific or technical evidence that's available in support of that determination, what does the review of the determination look like? And, you know, from the perspective of this particular fact sheet, the main point that we were trying to make here is just that as far as an individual farm developing sufficient justification to be able to apply this standard in the case of an alternative, it's a really high burden and is unlikely for an individual farm to take on their own. Whereas in the case of a variance, there may be a bit more resources available at, you know, the state agency level, for example, to be able to pursue a variance and collect the necessary scientific data to be able to justify a change in the standard. So at sort of that high level, you know, again, we're talking about who's conducting the evaluation of the standard, and then really what is the quantitative and qualitative scientific data and evidence that's backing it up. And then in terms of, you know, more specifics about what that might look like, this forthcoming article that should be out really soon provides a bit more examples in terms of other programs and how they've approached that question.
And we'll be sure to include those future resources that you mentioned, Sophia, in our newsletter to this particular group, since we've talked about them here, and make them available. Okay, going back to the chat box, there was a statement or sort of a question from Levo Moore. In Minnesota, we're finding that the processors often own the crop and may be in fact a farm under the produce safety rule. It has meant working with our manufactured food inspection program closely to determine how to engage with the facility and what is required under multiple regulations.
I'm not sure if this is relating to some of the stuff we've already done, but it has a bit of flavor of the market intermediary fact sheet that we have coming, where we are trying to talk about some of the considerations that people need to take when trying to figure out if they are a food hub, if they're a produce auction, if they're a retail food establishment, if they are a processing facility, if they're a secondary activities farm, based on some of their activities, and how then they would fall under either the produce safety rule, the preventive controls rule, or neither. So that is also in design right now and is coming soon, but I think perhaps would speak to some of this comment.
Okay, are there other questions? Feel free to raise your hand and ask question verbally or use the chat box.
Hi, Gretchen. This is Betsy. I want to follow up with Elizabeth.
Betsy, you're a little hard to hear. You're cutting out a little bit.
I'll put it in the chat box for Elizabeth. It's about the definition of a farm.
Okay, I heard definition of a farm. So if you can enter it in the chat box, then we can read it out loud. Sorry about that.
I did have a question when I was at I think it was the Western Center regional meeting about liability transferring to employees of a farm. So if, for example, the question was if the responsibility of the food safety practices falls to a supervisor or whomever on the farm, does liability extend to them if they are not in compliance with the produce safety rule? So I thought I would just raise that question because others may have that or have heard that similarly raised. And we can talk about that. Sophia, did you want to?
Sorry, can you repeat that, Elizabeth?
Yeah, so I'd had a question about whether or not liability under the produce safety rule extended to the individual employee of a farm if they were responsible for carrying out the food safety plan or the food safety activities on that farm to be in compliance with the rule. And then there was a foodborne, there was an outbreak traced back to that operation.
Yeah, interesting question. And I think, it goes back a lot to some of what in that liability fact sheet, we're really trying to differentiate, which is your civil liability obligations, and then your obligations under the produce safety rule. And that being more of a criminal liability perspective. And so from a civil liability perspective, we're talking about somebody who is harmed eating produce that comes from an operation and can trace the foodborne illness back to that operation. Do they have some civil claim that they can bring for damages against somebody, anybody, everybody in some cases? And oftentimes that, the unfortunate response to that question is like, yes, conceivably just about anybody that was in that line, that chain of getting the produce from the farm to the person who eats it could conceivably have a lawsuit brought against them under civil liability. Whether that would be likely to happen based on, you know, the ability of that person to pay, right? So a farm employee versus the farm business itself. And then also whether there could be, whether the claim has merit, you know, against that individual for their role in the injury occurring. Would also then, you know, maybe a case could be brought, but how likely is it to succeed? It might not be that high against the individual employee versus the person who's responsible for ensuring that the employees have the training that they need to be able to carry out their food safety responsibilities on the farm. So from the civil liability perspective, like the answer is always sort of like, yes, anybody could sue anybody, but are they likely to, and is it likely to succeed is sort of a different question. From the criminal liability perspective or the FSMA PSR compliance perspective, I mean, again, I think that really goes back to, you know, who carries the ultimate responsibility for ensuring that people are trained to be able to carry out their responsibilities under the produce safety rule. And so to me, that also is something where, you know, whoever the enforcer is would likely be looking to the person that carries that ultimate responsibility, which is likely to be the business owner as opposed to an individual employee.
Okay, well, going back to the comment that was made when we were talking about the farm and how processors often own the crop, Betsy's clarification, this was for Elizabeth, was how has this all been impacted by the fact that the farm definition isn't finalized? I guess that's a question for either one of you.
Yeah, so in that fact sheet, we are going with the current definition and have provided the caveat that the farm definition is under review, and so the information is subject to change. And so in the event that it changes, then we would reevaluate that fact sheet. But right now, the way that we're presenting it is just based on the current farm definition.
And I think that some of the legal concepts applied will likely continue to apply. Of course, it depends on what the definition looks like, if and when it changes. But in terms of, for example, the discussion about when you might have to consider sales across multiple separate legal entities, I think that question is likely to still be relevant, even if we see changes to the farm definition. And you know, whether you can have sort of an LLC that you set up that's really just on paper alone, you know, and if that is sort of legally sound and can be seen as a separate entity is also sort of a legal principle that I think exists beyond whatever the ultimate farm definition might be.
Great. There was a question about state agencies. So the question was, can state agencies make everyone comply with PSR even if they are exempt? Do state agencies have that authority?
That's that's an interesting question. And I think that it's one that, well, I would consider it in a few different ways. Right? One is that the qualified exemption exists in FSMA, the statute, the law that Congress passed. And so, you know, that creates sort of a minimum exemption that is intended to exist throughout the regulations. And so FDA was not able to change that in the regulation because, again, it exists in statute, and FSMA creates sort of a regulatory floor that all states then are required to at least comply with that, right, regulatory floor. Whether states can go above that is an interesting question. And I would think that if, you know, the state passed a law saying that, you know, we're going to require every farm, regardless of size, to comply with the PSR, the state could have the authority to potentially do that. But I do wonder if that would be challenged as being in some way, you know, sufficiently different than what the federal standard is requiring, and would be challenged under those grounds. So I haven't seen it. I think it's possible a state might try to do that. I think it's possible if a state did that there may be a lawsuit challenging their authority to do that, but it's certainly not a resolved issue. Be curious if there are any other state agency folks on the line that have a thought or an opinion on that as well, or FDA folks.
Well, I'll give them the opportunity to chime in if they have any information to share. Feel free to share it in the chat box or raise their hand. But I think I'll move on to a question that came in while you were speaking about any of the research so far or any of the upcoming fact sheets touched on determining PSR status for cooperatives, because they've had that question in the TAN for almost 2 years now, specifically about how to calculate sales for those entities, for cooperatives. And they're just curious if you've unearthed anything in this area.
Possibly. It's hard to know without a little more detail on the sort of the nature of the question. Is it about how to count sales when you are selling through a cooperative? I don't know if you can add a bit more into the chat box.
Yeah, here, Alexandra, I've allowed you to unmute yourself, so go ahead.
Hi, yeah, this is Alex. Yes, it was about how to determine sales, basically, whether you count the individual producer's sales, whether you count the sales of the cooperative, whether it's the direct sales of the cooperative or like whatever the producer gets back from the cooperative, just anything like that, basically.
To figure out the compliance obligations of the co-op and then also the entities that sell into it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the upcoming fact sheet will talk about that a bit when there's sort of an intermediary. I think in the cooperative scenario, it should be more straightforward. I don't know if you have a specific, cooperative that you're working with and would want to reach out to me and share some of those details. I'd be happy to try to talk through it a bit more based on the specifics.
Sure, we can send you whatever we've sent to the TAN. Yeah. We haven't gotten, we've kept checking on it, but it's stumped them for 2 years apparently. So maybe it's easier than it seems, who knows?
I'd be happy to take a look though and connect back with you about that.
Yeah, and I will say the reason why that fact sheet isn't out yet is because we have also been waiting for some clarity on holding and the definition of holding and what goes into holding, because that is also a hinging point of some of these entities and how long they might be holding produce. And so I don't know if that's a component of it, but in any case, there's I think some moving pieces that may be contributing to no answer.
Okay, there was another question that came in through the Q&A box. On the state-by-state map in California, under the does the state law address penalties question, it says no, California does not address FSMA penalties. So is there federal penalty guidance that the state would default to then?
Right, this question is about California specifically, and California, I believe, is operating through credentialing as, credentialed officers of the FDA. And so the California entry is a little confusing because what I recall in that one is that California does have its own relevant law, but the law is basically just saying, we have the authority to work with FDA to enforce these laws, through credentialing essentially. So the state law doesn't have any other specific details. And so because they're working as credentialed agents of the FDA, it would just be FDA law that's being enforced. And whether that means it's the state agency that ultimately would be assessing the penalties or FDA, I think the penalties that would apply would really just be in the instance that a criminal case is brought under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. That would apply. There isn't like a separate set of PSR fines, right, that the FDA would levy. Does that answer your question?
We'll let Kelly respond whether that scratches the itch or not. But I am going back to the chat box from Louisa, and this was actually a question. Whoop, my earbud's falling out. Question that I had about continuing on this project. Are there going to be additional work in this area? Specifically, she was asking about, the traceability rule that just came out and that might impact some farms and food facilities.
So I think I'll start and then Sophia, you can add. The answer is, in the very least, we are maintaining the resources that are on the site to make sure that they stay up to date and accurate, and continuing to connect with agencies across the country to make sure that the map is reflective, since there's still a lot of ongoing changes. And Sophia and I are in conversation around what additional work may be needed, not only under the Produce Safety Rule, but also the Preventive Controls Rule. The frame of this specific project is closing, but there is interest in continuing our partnership forward to continue to look at stuff, but what that looks like exactly, we don't know yet.
So if there are specific legal questions that you're hearing, or topics that you think would be useful for us to pursue, we certainly would love to hear that. I imagine there are many more questions out there that remain unanswered. And so we'd love to think through what additional resources we might be able to develop.
Yeah, so actually, interestingly, when we did the survey, it was 2 years ago, right? So like things, or even 3 years ago, look so different now than they did then. And we tackled all of the questions that were identified by that initial survey. And so we didn't leave stuff unanswered. That was where people were at that point in terms of trying to understand the rule and how that might impact them, or some of these legal questions. And so now, as we're getting into inspections and things are rolling out and new questions are arising, especially as people might be receiving inspectional reports that are in non-compliance or whatever, some of these other things start to actually trickle down, there may be some new questions that suddenly appear that people wouldn't have considered 3 years ago. And so in that case, yeah, I mean, I think the landscape of our understanding of what even needs to be addressed is very different than what it once was. So that would certainly inform it. I think one question or two questions now and then would be an odd way to approach it. Instead, we would sort of revamp and sort of reassess the landscape to see where the questions are now and how we might help to further that understanding.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Anybody from the PSA team have questions or comments that they want to add in? I'll give you guys an opportunity now.
The other thing that Sophia and I have talked about is, which was not part of this project, but something that we're very aware of, is that as people start to read these resources and try to interact with growers as they try to disseminate this information, we are interested to know if there's supplemental stuff that would be helpful to help with disseminating this information forward. So if it's a slide deck that might go as add-on to the end of a grower training, or a short video that says, here are the major takeaways from this particular fact sheet and how you might use it, or the highlights that you might want to disseminate when you're talking to a grower and relaying this information, what would be helpful to you in using these resources is great information that we are interested in hearing about, so that we can actually ensure that this content is usable and approachable and can be carried forward.
I know that, speaking from the PSA side of things, I've done quite a few workshops specifically with tree fruit growers, where the question about those farm definitions definitely comes into play, and also the intermediaries. And we have sort of an interim slide deck that we've been using to try to describe those. But I think some materials that could be used in conjunction with a PSA training to explain some of those business entities nuances might be useful. I know we've also fielded a lot of questions about cooperatives and produce auctions and food hubs and those sort of tricky situations that aren't always straightforward. So that is definitely something that could be potential for future educational resources. Okay, any other questions? These are all great questions. And maybe once you all have a chance to read the fact sheets that we shared with you, you'll come up with a bunch more. So we will be sure to include both Elizabeth and Sophia's contact information. Should you have, it sounds like you guys would be willing to accept some scenarios and provide assistance if you can in those cases, or if there's any clarification needed on those fact sheets. So.
Definitely. Yes, we so appreciate your interest and hope that they're useful for you. And as Elizabeth said, just really want to make sure that they are, that they're just available and you're able to use them in the course of your outreach and education work, because I think that they're going to be more useful or valuable to sort of the folks on the ground if they're coming through you than if you just sort of stumble across them on a website. So we really want to make them work for you in the work that you do.
Great. Well, I don't see any other questions, just a lot of thank yous. So I just want to close out the call by saying thank you guys both for being here today on the call to share these resources with our group and for developing the resources and leading these efforts. I know a lot of these questions are challenging, and they're real questions that business owners need to know in order to function and sell their produce and food products. So thank you guys for all of this work. And I just opportunity for you all to say anything in closing, if you have any additional comments that you want to share with the group.
Just thanks.
Okay. Well, our next call is going to be held on Monday, June 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern. As I mentioned, it's going to be focused on the lead trainer process and more specifically about tools and tips for becoming a lead trainer. And there'll also be a panel discussion with some experienced lead trainers during that call. So we encourage you, if you're interested in becoming a lead trainer or know somebody who is interested, to attend that call. And as usual, it'll be recorded. It's open to anybody. It'll be posted on our website after the call. So with that, thank you so much to Elizabeth and Sophia and for everybody attending. And I saw a question quickly from Dare asking about the registration link for next month's meeting. We will send that out in an email. It's not prepared yet, but we'll make sure that's available, or you can visit our website probably in the next week or so. We'll have that registration link up and available, but it's always, the latest stuff is always on our website. So thanks again to everybody for joining today, and have a great rest of your week. All right, take care, everybody.